The war between Ukraine and Russia has long been at the top of the world agenda. At one end of this relentless war, there is the historical Black Sea Peninsula, Vladimir Putin's final red line. Volodymyr Zelensky's imaginary Crimea holds the key to ending the Ukraine war. By emphasizing that everything started with Crimea and will end with Crimea, Ukraine announced that it would continue its offensive to take back its lands until the end. The moment of the war's breaking point will begin at this point. In June, the Ukrainian armed forces launched counter-offensive operations. The target of the Ukrainian forces is Crimea, and the Russian army feels this to their lowest units. Ukraine's breakthrough in Crimea witnessed the mass flight or evacuation of Russian citizens from Crimea. For this reason, we witness that the Russian army strengthens the defense in Crimea and evacuates relatives of officers and important civilians to Russia. Let's take a closer look at the breaking moments in the Black Sea Peninsula. Families and relatives of the Russian forces on the peninsula have been making preparations to escape from Crimea for a long time. The residents of this peninsula who were preparing to flee by selling their immovables and real estates, as well as the families of the soldiers and the relatives of pro-Russian officials, began to be evacuated. This ignites a social indignation from Crimea. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's chief representative in Crimea, Tamila Tasheva, said on national television that the Russians were beginning to worry about Ukraine's effort to recapture the region. About 500,000 to 800,000 Russians currently live in Crimea illegally. Russians may be forcibly deported in accordance with Ukrainian legislation and international legal norms. Fearing this possibility, Russian citizens sell their properties and leave Crimea. Tasheva said that there are no statistics about people going because we don't have access to it. We understand that these are thousands of people who left the territory of Crimea, and this can be seen even in the Kerch tales. The Russian evacuation of Crimea is also seen in the real estate market. It is not possible to say the exact number by looking at the real estate market, but there are many who leave. Also in November, the head of the Crimean Project and education platform hub, Emil Ibragimov, stated that the Russians fled from Crimea to the neighboring Russian region of Krasnodar because they feared that Ukraine would eventually liberate the Black Sea Peninsula. On the other hand, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces reported that the families of the Russian invaders were taken to Russia from Perevaln in the Crimea. The Chief of Staff report says that once again, certain categories of citizens are being evacuated from temporarily occupied Crimea. Recently, military personnel of the Russian occupation forces stationed in Perevaln are sending their families to Russia. In a report published by the Crimean National Resistance Group, it was stated that the occupiers had made a list of workers and their families subject to priority evacuation, and that in some cities the plans had already been drawn up and approved. A Russian media organ made a statement on this subject. In the statement made, allegations were made that an earthquake might be in question. This is pretty funny. However, the media later pointed out that since it is not yet possible to predict earthquakes, it can be assumed that officials were evacuated due to the threat of the Ukrainian army advancing on the peninsula. The evacuation of certain categories of citizens from the temporarily occupied Crimea began. It was also announced that evacuation plans are being prepared in the town of Krasnoperekopsk in the north of the peninsula, close to the mainland of Ukraine. On the other hand, urban construction companies temporarily stopped their activities in the occupied Crimea due to the supply exceeding the demand in the real estate market. In February, it was reported that the officers in Simferopol, which was under Russian occupation, were preparing to evacuate at the so-called state-owned enterprises of Simferopol. Officers were given to fill out questionnaires in which, in case of evacuation, the full name of the evacuee and the composition of the family were indicated. So what was the main reason that made the authorities and citizens in Crimea so uneasy? Especially the recent attacks in Melitopol made the Russian presence in Crimea very uneasy. Because Melitopol is a critical region controlling the land corridor between Mariupol and Crimea, Russian occupation forces lost a helicopter at an air base in the temporarily occupied Melitopol. The video of the crash plane belonging to the army of the aggressor state was published on social media. The footage was taken by a Russian officer in another helicopter. The published video shows how a Russian multi-purpose transport helicopter with the so-called Mi-8 or its modification takes off from the airport. Within seconds of the video, the camera captures the remains of a burned-out helicopter belonging to the occupying army. However, due to the complete destruction of the fuselage and other elements of the aircraft, it is difficult to establish which helicopter remains were found at the military airfield in the temporarily occupied Melitopol-Zaporizhia region. It is currently unknown whether this Russian helicopter was burned down by a Ukrainian attack or for other reasons, such as a technical malfunction or emergency landing at the military airport in Melitopol. Russian combat and transport helicopters, as well as Russian attack planes, which the occupiers used to strike the positions of the Ukrainian defense forces in the south. Melitopol in the Zaporizhia region has been under Russian occupation almost since the beginning of the all-out invasion of Russian troops. The invaders see the city behind, so the enemy's troops and equipment periodically come there at the same time. Explosions are constantly heard in the city and collaborators working for the aggressor country are destroyed. If you remember, on June 28, a total of 5 explosions were reported in Melitopol in just 24 hours. Such attacks have now become routine for residents. Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorov announced that a loud explosion occurred in the Russian-occupied town of Melitopol. The explosions were caused by an attack on a Russian base near a farm in the Ukrainian village of Semenivka. This farm was located in a large area that the Russian forces had previously captured and used as a headquarters. The Ukrainians knew that the Russians made military supplies from this headquarters to the city of Tokmak, Berdyansk, and the Zaporizhia front lines. In fact, it will be enough to look at the topographic map to understand this, because considering that the Ukrainians now control the Kherson-Dnipro direction, a significant part of the front lines in Zaporizhia, Melitopol is a suitable city to support the clashes on the southern front lines of Russia. But all of Moscow's plans were turned upside down after Ukrainian forces targeted the Russian military base in Melitopol with their latest attacks. While Russian leader Vladimir Putin was waiting for a victory from the southern trenches, the Ukrainians destroyed the Russian headquarters in Melitopol, which demoralized the Russian soldiers in this region. If the Ukrainians successfully liberate Melitopol, Russia will no longer have an uninterrupted land corridor from Donbass to the Crimea. Therefore, Russian troops will be stuck on Ukrainian territory, both in the southern trenches and in the eastern front lines. The Ukrainian armed forces, on the other hand, will have the chance to advance their offensive operations to the Crimea. So what is the significance of Crimea? Crimea, which caused wars between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire in history, passed to Russia in 1783 during the time of Tsarina Catherine. The peninsula belonged to Russia until Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gifted Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. Khrushchev, himself of Ukrainian origin, gave Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic on the 300th anniversary of its entry into Russian domination. Since both countries were under the roof of the Soviet Union, this decision, which was not given much importance at that time, gained serious importance for Moscow and Kiev after the collapse of the USSR. The fact that the Black Sea Fleet, which he attaches great importance to, remained in Ukraine, which is at risk of getting closer to the west, became a matter of concern for Russia. The peninsula, whose population is mostly Russian, was connected to Russia as a result of the referendum held in 2014. As a result, the tension that started in 2014 reached its peak in February 2022 and turned into a war. The Russian leader aimed to seize the whole of Ukraine as he annexed Crimea. However, these ambitions of Putin were interrupted by the great resistance of the Ukrainian soldiers. It is a matter of curiosity how long the Russian leader will withstand this resistance. Having upset Russia's plans towards the end of December, Kiev now appears to have taken control of the war on most of its front lines, especially in the eastern front lines of Ukraine. As the tension and violence of the war reached its peak, the critical moves of the Ukrainian armed forces completely changed the rules of the game. With the performance of the Kiev army in the last days, the losses in the city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk region of Russia are increasing rapidly. HIMARS artillery and special forces of the Kiev army began to destroy one by one the most strategic military bases of the Moscow army in Donetsk and Luhansk. Explosions on the front lines such as Makivka, Solidar, Kremlin and Statov in the operations of the Kiev forces inflicted heavy losses on Russia. These days, the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces come to the fore in and around the city of Bakhmut. Snipers and Special Operations Forces of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine stopped the advance of a Russian unit which was going to attack the stronghold of the Ukrainian defenders in a direction near Bakhmut of the Donetsk region, in the area close to the Ukrainian military base around the borders of Bakhmut, where fierce fighting was taking place. Russian troops were not even aware that they had stepped in the line of fire. But with the involvement of Ukrainian Special Operations Forces and snipers, this Russian group came under crossfire. It was recorded that the snipers of the Ukrainian State Border Guard Service, while spying on these invading Russian forces, identified the head of the unit and eliminated the commander and a machine gunner with accurate shots. Seeing their commander dead, the invaders were afraid to attack and had to flee the area. While it's not known exactly how many casualties the invading troops suffered as a result of the attacks, this military base area considered Sidard, one of Ukraine's fortresses in Bakhmut, is still under the protection of the Kiev Army's special forces and snipers. It didn't take long for Russia to put its retaliation plans into action against these attacks. Yesterday, Moscow forces carried out 7 missile attacks on the city of Kramatorsk in the Donetsk region. Russian officials reported that many deaths occurred in the Ukrainian army as a result of these attacks. Moscow's claim was to somehow make people forget the defeat at Bakhmut. However, contrary to Russia's statements, the head of the Ministry Administration of Ukraine's Donetsk region, Pavlo Kirilenko, stated that there were no casualties in the attack by the Russian army, which fired 7 missiles on the city of Kramatorsk. The latest images from the city of Kramatorsk, where the attack took place, confirmed the statements of Pavlo Kirilenko. While the high tension on the Donetsk fronts continues, the Luhansk region has also started to become very active. In recent days, partisan groups in this region also supported the pressure to attack attacks of the Ukrainian forces in the occupied part of the Luhansk region near the town of Shastya. Ukrainian partisans blew up a railway line in the area where Russian troops were transporting military equipment and ammunition in the attack. Ukrainian partisan groups use violent explosives to destroy a railway line between the city of Luhansk and the village of Lantratova, near Shastya. In fact, it was previously established by Ukrainian partisan groups that the specified section of the railway was used by the Russians to transport military equipment, manpower and ammunition in the opposite direction. Along this line, the invaders were sending Ukrainian grain into Russian territory. In addition, the Moscow army was actively using this railway line for critical military shipments, especially at night. However, as a result of this offensive operation by Ukrainian partisans after the railway line was blown up with explosive materials, as we mentioned, this line near Shastya was damaged beyond use. While this striking success of the Ukrainian partisans dealt a heavy blow to the logistics arms of the Russians in this region, the inability of the invaders to provide military support to the Luhansk fronts for a certain period of time caused major problems. Some of the fiercest fighting on the front was raging in the Luhansk region around the town of Kremlin due to Russian troops' attempts to secure the right flank of the Bakhmut sectors. For this reason, the railway line near Shastya was of vital importance for the invading troops. At present, it's inevitable that Ukrainian forces will seize the opportunity from the interruption of the Russians' additional sources of military power on the fronts in Donetsk and Luhansk. It would have been a mistake for the Ukrainian forces not to take advantage of Russia's unfavorable situation when the situation was so delicate and complex. A few days ago, Ukrainian planes carried out 10 attacks on the assembly areas of Russian military personnel in the Luhansk region. It came as a surprise to the Moscow army that Kiev troops blew up Russia and Russian resources in Luhansk, while Russia was now focused on the Bakhmut-Avdiivka and Lyman front lines. The continuation of this advantage by Ukraine was actually an expected move, but only the address of the next attacks was unknown. Russia, on the other hand, wanted to take the pain of the crushing defeats in Luhansk. In Donetsk, in this region, the invaders carried out 19 airstrikes on 3 settlements in total. Fortunately, no casualties were encountered in these areas where the bombardment continued for a long time. The fact that Russia returned empty-handed from the attacks carried out by the Russian army greatly lowers the expectations of the military units in the Moscow army in the war. Currently, there is a serious communication breakdown and disagreement among the Russian soldiers, especially since the last few days. The invading troops in the Zaporizhia region reflect this situation. Moscow has deployed Russian Guard units to the front lines in Zaporizhia to maintain military discipline and prevent panic from spreading among the personnel of the occupying forces operating on Ukraine's front lines. But the Russian soldiers in this region are quite disturbed by the course of the war. Almost all of the Russian troops here are forcibly held on the front lines. It was reported that some of the invading troops who were overwhelmed by the pressure of the Moscow administration and the Russian Ministry of Defense fled from the Zaporizhia region, while another part surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces. A striking situation in this regard in the past few days has revealed the attitude of the Russian administration towards its soldiers who intend to surrender. A few days ago, it turned out that 6 Russian soldiers were shot down near Skistofila, who had deserted their military bases to surrender to the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Although there are not many details about the details of this scandal, the value of the lives of the soldiers of the Moscow army was proven once again with this shocking situation. Moreover, in recent days, Moscow authorities have begun to spread disinformation that the Ukrainian Defense Forces will bombard medical facilities in the Luhansk region, where wounded Russian occupiers are being treated in order to discredit the Ukrainian military leadership. This misinformation was even denied by Russian soldiers in the Moscow army. Some Russian soldiers who surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces in the Luhansk region admitted that the commanders of the Moscow army had given them false information about Ukraine. Moscow's strategy in this regard may be to prevent the soldiers in its army from surrendering to the Ukrainian armed forces. However, due to this method, Moscow is actually accelerating the surrender of its soldiers to Ukraine by creating an environment of pressure. On the contrary, after the new year, there was an incredible increase in the number of Russian soldiers surrendering to the Ukrainian armed forces. The reason for this increase is seen to a large extent as the offensive operations carried out by the Kiev army on a large part of the war fronts. In recent days, Russian soldiers who want to save their lives and are suffocated by Russia's oppressive policies and fleeing Stalinist-like war dictates are looking for the solution in the Ukrainian armed forces. But Russian leader Vladimir Putin continues to impose heavy sanctions to prevent these capitulations. But we all know a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Putin broke all these rings one by one. Therefore, there is no bond left among the Russian soldiers to strengthen that weakest link. There have been tense moments recently in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as the hostilities on Ukrainian land raged unabated. The impacts of the war started to make their way back into the cities of Russia. The region of Crimea and its neighboring territories, which are currently at the most vital stage of Kiev's major offensive operations, appear to be areas where the concentration of explosions and air attacks is occurring. A tremendous explosion took place not too long ago in the city of Krasnodar, which is located on the shore of the Sea of Azov and is close to the Crimean Peninsula. This remarkable circumstance produced an impact similar to a chilly shower in Moscow. As a result of the fact that the Russians were preoccupied with the fighting in Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk at the time, the Kremlin was generally taken aback by the abrupt reporting of explosions in cities close to Crimea. Let's investigate these crucial turning points together, paying attention to every little detail in the Krasnodar region of southern Russia. Reports have come in of a massive explosion that occurred close to the Primorsko-Akhtarsk airport, an allegation that Russian air defense fired down a missile that was meant at attacking the fuel tank of the airspace has not been independently verified, despite the fact that the claim was made by a Telegram channel that is associated with the Kremlin. A snapshot of the crater, which was approximately 200 meters from the airport and was 10 meters in width and 4 meters in depth, was included in the Telegram post. According to the mayor of Krasnodar, Veniamin Kondratiev, an investigation into the incident is currently underway and there have been no reports of injuries. Kondratiev stated that all the details had become obvious, but he did not elaborate on the reason why the explosions occurred. The fact that the Russian official is reluctant to provide specifics regarding the explosions that occurred in Krasnodar may be an indication that Moscow is once again attempting to hide something. According to various sources in Ukraine, the Russian air base in Krasnodar has reportedly become inoperable after all of these explosions. Vladimir Putin appears to be operating in a massive vacuum when it comes to employing the Air Force and organizing UAV and missile strikes, because it is common knowledge that Russia employed the airspace of Primorsko-Akhtarsk in order to fire ammunition manufactured in Iran by Shahid at Ukraine. However, as of right now, it is not possible to launch unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, or other types of military aircraft from this territory. According to the Ukrainian Air Force, it takes roughly an hour for these kamikaze drones to reach Ukrainian soil if they are fired from the Primorsko-Akhtarsk airfield, which is the location where the drone was originally launched from. A recent bombardment on Ukraine was carried out by Russia, and according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia even launched Tate-shot drones and 3-caliber cruise missiles in a single night. However, the Ukrainian air defense took down all of these drones and missiles with their firepower. These Russian attacks, it has been claimed by Ukrainian authorities, were carried out prior to the big explosions that took place in Krasnodar. The information that was provided by Ukrainian sources was confirmed by the fact that the Russians are currently unable to execute UAV flights due to the inaccessibility of their airbase in light of the current scenario. Residents of Krasnodar have stated that the smoke column that appeared in the city's airspace following the explosions did not last for an especially lengthy period of time, and a significant number of intervention vehicles rushed to the Krasnodar airbase. According to reports, Russian officials are continuing to beef up security at the Primorsko-Akhtarsk air base in Krasnodar. The Russians were unable to carry out an airstrike on Ukrainian land near the Crimea as a result of this astonishing explosion, which prevented them from doing so because of the crucial and strategic importance of the airbase in Krasnodar. The Ukrainian authorities in Kiev did not claim responsibility for the attack. However, it is believed that the Ukrainian army was responsible for carrying out the strike in Krasnodar. The majority of sources from across the world agree that the Ukrainians targeted the Krasnodar airfield in order to render it inoperable and prevent Russian efforts to launch drone and missile strikes against civilian targets in the Crimean Peninsula. Taking into account the fact that Krasnodar is situated on both sides of the Sea of Azov, as well as in close proximity to Crimea, which Russia unjustly stole from Ukraine in 2014, it stands to reason that Ukrainian incursions were the source of the explosions that occurred in the Primorsko-Akhtarsk airspace. There is only one truth to be found regarding the incident. Regardless of who planned and carried it out, it would appear that Russia will be unable to strike Ukraine with drones or missiles for an extended period of time if it continues to use its airbase in Krasnodar because of the explosions in Krasnodar. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have an opportunity to step up their offensive operations against Russian cities in the region as well as on the Crimean Peninsula. This is especially true in light of the recent events in Krasnodar. Long-range jet-powered drones from the air of the Soviet Union and British Storm Shadow long-range missiles are both in the inventory of the Ukrainian army. To put it another way, these unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, and missile defense systems provide the Ukrainians the ability to launch an attack beyond the range that was previously specified. Already, key air bases and military sites controlled by the Russians were included in Kiev's invasion plans. As a result of the loss of an air base from which the Russians launched drone assaults in a significant city like Krasnodar, Crimea and Russian cities in close proximity to the peninsula are no longer adequately defended. In point of fact, the existence of such an explosion or offensive operation on the southern front lines of Ukraine was made abundantly evident by a number of hints and indications because just prior to the explosions in Krasnodar, there were some quite active hours in a Russian city that is located in close proximity to this region. Recent events led to the destruction of a power station in the city of Rostov, which is situated to the northeast of Krasnodar. On June 14, the Russian state news agency TASS reported that a significant fire had broken out at the Novocherkassk thermal power plant, which is located in the Rostov Oblast of Russia. Residents of Novocherkassk reportedly heard an explosion just moments before the fire broke out at 13:40 local time, as reported by the Novocherkassk Sagodnya Telegram channel. It was reported that the 6th unit of the facility at the Rostov thermal power plant was where the fire's origin was. This massive fire eventually reached the 5th apartment and extended across at least 400 meters squared of space. According to reports originating in Russia, the explosion that led to the fire was triggered by a failure to comply with safety safeguards that were in place during the repair work. According to TASS, as a result of the massive fire that occurred at the Novocherkassk thermal power plant, 3 persons suffered burn injuries and 150 people were forced to leave the fire, according to reports from Russian media, was brought under control. However, Russian authorities have pointed the finger of blame at Kiev for the explosion and fire that occurred in Rostov. The Ukrainian authorities have not provided any explanation concerning the grave situation in Rostov.